So far in this series, I've mostly covered topics related to the Christian Middle Ages, since this is my area of specialty. Although the whole point of this series is to get a more global perspective on the world around the same time. And for that reason, I've decided to go a little bit out of my comfort zone with this next video, although admittedly in an area which I do know more about. The Middle East has long been a land of intriguing and complex civilizations, which unfortunately don't always get the attention they deserve from Western audiences. Today we're going to look at a fascinating state, a seeming anomaly which had a pretty important, if indirect, impact on this part of the world. As we look back at Iraq and Eastern Iran 1,000 years ago, we're going to look at the Buyid Dynasty and their lands in the 1020s. By the 10th century, the Abbasid Caliphate had become a shadow of its former past. More and more local rulers arose to rule their lands independently, while just paying simple lip service to the Caliph in Baghdad. In Iran and Iraq, this was no different, and various Turkish soldiers had managed to impose themselves as governors over vast swaths of land. This is the context in which the Buyids rose to power. The original Buyids were the sons of a man named Buya, who was supposedly a simple fisherman. They were Daylamites, that is, people from the regions of Daylam and Gilan on the southern coast of the Caspian Sea. The Daylamites had a long tradition of serving as mercenaries for the various rulers of Iran, which gave an opportunity for the sons of a fisherman to rise to prominence. The eldest son was Ali ibn Buya, who had fought for a Daylamite leader who had taken over the region of Jebal in central Iran. Ali eventually went out on his own to the region of Fars in the south, and he made an arrangement with several wealthy landowners who promised to finance his venture to take over the province from Yakut, a Turkish governor who'd been oppressing them. Ali succeeded, and he became the ruler of Fars in 932. Ali's two brothers would also get the chance to rule. Over the past few years, the caliphs in Baghdad had become puppets to usurpers who took over the city, but none of them could hold on to it for very long, and there was a rapid succession of leadership. In 945, after the death of the most recent one, Ahmad ibn Buya marched on the city and negotiated with the caliph al-Mustafki to make him the emir of Iraq. Finally, in 947, the last brother, Hassan ibn Buya, went back to Jebal and took the city of Ray, making himself the emir of that region. The Buyid Confederation had been created. These three regions remained the main centers of power for the Buyids, although they did splinter slightly over time, since Daylamite tradition made it that lands were typically divided amongst all sons. Over time, many towns within the emirates had their own Buyid emirs, but by and large, they were mostly subject to one of these three main emirates. As in most societies at the time, the vast majority of people in the Buyid realms lived in rural communities. They were largely agricultural, and there was a mix of small landowners working their own farms and large estates owned by wealthy elites and worked by tenants. There were also cities where some of these estate owners lived, and Iran was gradually becoming more urbanized, but Iranian cities were nothing compared to the likes of Baghdad and Iraq. Because of this, taxes in Iran tended to be fixed rates of coin, whereas in Iraq, farmers paid a percentage of their crops, which would then be sold in Baghdad to feed its massive population. There was also a large semi-nomadic population in the mountainous regions, such as the Kurdish tribes living in the Zagros Mountains. But these were largely independent from Buyid authority, and they cooperated more through tribal alliances than as subjects, and the Buyids had no illusions that they were actually ruling over them. Out of the three regions, Fars, with its capital in Shiraz, was without a doubt the most prosperous and powerful. The landowning elites were very wealthy, and their cooperation with the emirs in Shiraz, starting with Ali, allowed the Buyids there to become quite wealthy themselves, and, importantly, it allowed them to pay their army, largely composed of other Daylamites. The army made up a separate class from the landed peasantry, so it was important to be able to pay them, or they might start causing trouble. They also gradually became more and more of a political force throughout the Buyid era, since the Buyids were essentially a military dictatorship, and they relied upon their troops in order to stay in power, and the Daylamites knew this. Jebal was not nearly as prosperous as Fars, but it still had a similar organization. The main difference, though, was that the landed elite were not nearly as wealthy, and so the emirs here relied more on direct alliances with nearby tribes to support them. They had a smaller army of their own, but they frequently married into traditional royal families in Daylam and Tabaristan to ensure support, and made regular alliances with the Kurds of the Zagros Mountains and other groups whose autonomy they guaranteed. Finally, there was Iraq. Although Iraq had been the power base of the Abbasids, it was now a shadow of its former past. One of the reasons for the collapse of the Caliphate was mismanagement and wars making the valley of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers far less prosperous, and the Buyids were hardly in a position to change that. By the 1020s, several Bedouin tribes had alienated large parts of Iraq from the emirs, taking in the revenues but refusing to acknowledge Buyid authority and therefore passing nothing along to them. But that was far from the only issue. You see, taking Baghdad through negotiation was a bit of a double-edged sword. The Abbasids had established a tradition of creating slave soldiers called either Ghilman or Mamluks. Now, the term slave soldier might make it seem like they were of low status, but the reality was quite the opposite. These Ghilman were raised to be a warrior elite and became some of the most powerful people in the realm. The idea was that as foreign-born slaves taken at a young age, they wouldn't have any connections to local factions, and they would be exclusively loyal to their lord and no one else, avoiding some of the conflicting politics that was common when relying on tribal alliances. These Ghilman were usually called Turks, and in fact the Turkish governors I mentioned previously had been Ghilman, though in reality they were from a variety of ethnicities, mostly from Central Asia, though not all strictly Turkish. In any case, as you might have guessed, these powerful military elites were not always automatically loyal to their lord, and so they had to be appeased, or they risked taking over, as those aforementioned governors had done. And because the Buyids had taken Baghdad through negotiation, they inherited this class of powerful slave soldiers. In order to make them happy, they were given a large portion of the revenues from taxation in southern Iraq through the Iqta system, where lands were divided and taxes were given directly to the Turks as their payment. This in turn meant that the emir didn't have as much control over his own finances, and he was rarely left with much to use at the end of the day. The historian Hugh argues that the only emirs who were able to do much in Iraq were those who also ruled Fars at the same time. In the end, though, the Turks didn't just step into line once they got their Iqta. They, alongside the Daylamite portion of the army, held a lot of political control. In fact, by the 1020s, the Turkish faction had essentially driven the Daylamites, except for the emir himself, out of Iraq, and they were effectively the de facto rulers of the region. At the center of said region was Baghdad, the great city founded in 762 by the second Abbasid Caliph al-Mansur. Baghdad was past its prime at this point, but it was still a massive and important city, likely one of, if not the largest city in the world at the time. Nonetheless, it was having a rough time, especially by the 1020s. While the caliphs and the emirs lived a good life on the eastern bank of the Tigris, most of the city's inhabitants lived in poverty, and food security fluctuated. The city was rife with gangs and organized crime. In fact, these gangs often practically ruled the city, which was divided into various neighborhoods which were occasionally fought over. The division of the city helped keep the emirs in power, who frequently tried to use gangs against each other to keep their own position secure, but it certainly made life more difficult for the average citizen. These gangs and other factions in the city were often divided quite strongly along religious lines, and violence in Baghdad was often intimately connected with religious issues. On the topic of religion, the Buyid realms were quite diverse, containing Muslims of course, but also Jews, Christians, and Zoroastrians. The vast majority of the population were Muslim, mostly Sunni Muslims, but there was also a large Shia population, and this is where most of the conflict lay. Now, I don't have time here to explain this Sunni-Shia division in depth, but the very basic run of it is that the Shiites recognized the Prophet Muhammad's son-in-law Ali to be the legitimate successor to the Prophet after his death, inheriting both spiritual and secular authority as the Imam, and passing it on to his descendants, whereas the Sunni recognized Abu Bakr as the Caliph, who was the leader of the Muslim community, but didn't have the same religious authority as the Shiites give to the Imam. If you want to know more about this, I highly recommend watching Philip Holmes' videos on his channel Let's Talk Religion. He knows quite a bit about this, and he's made 2 separate videos on Ismaili and Twelver Shia Islam, and he goes into a lot of depth as to who they are. I'll leave a link in the description below. Back to our video though, the Buyids themselves were Shiites. It's often assumed that they were from the Zaydi branch because the Daylamites had recently been converted to Islam largely by Zaydi missionaries and descendants of Ali who had fled persecution to the far-off corners of the Islamic world. However, they may have been of the Twelver branch from the beginning. We don't actually know for sure. Not that this really matters because they were always very cagey about their religious affiliation. They were very aware that the vast majority of their subjects were Sunnis, and so they could never really afford to be all that heavy-handed about their religious views. One of their strategies to keep the support of their Sunni subjects was by keeping the Sunni caliph around as their nominal ruler, and they often took regnal names which emphasized their support of the Abbasid regime. For example, when Ali ibn Buya became emir of Fars, he became known as Imad al-Dawla, meaning pillar of the state, with state here being the Abbasid Caliphate. Though, make no mistake, the caliphs were puppets, and they were frequently replaced when the emir thought he was losing control over them. The Buyid promotion of Twelver Shiite scholars is also often interpreted through this lens, since the Twelvers believed in 12 imams, the last of which was in a state of greater occultation, that is, hiding, only to return at the end of days, which meant that the Buyids didn't have to compete with any other descendants of Ali claiming to be imam, and they didn't have to denounce the caliph and create a rift with their Sunni subjects. This is the context in which we should understand the joint condemnation by the Buyids and the Abbasid caliphs of the Fatimid caliph imams from the Ismaili branch of Shi'ism. However, of course, being Shiites, the Buyids allowed Shi'ism to prosper free of persecution, which allowed the community to grow. Shia and Sunni identities became more entrenched and defined, which had major consequences for the future of Islamic history. Shiite scholars began to develop specific doctrines unique to their branches, which finally made Shi'ism more than just Muslims who supported Ali. They began celebrating their own public festivals like Ashura and Eid al-Khadir. They developed their own compilations of hadith and wrote theological treatises which were unique to them. On the other side, the Sunnis also began to develop their own identity more in depth, with the caliph, especially al-Qadir, who was caliph during the 1020s, sponsoring scholars and codifying doctrine, paving the way for the so-called Sunni revival later in the century. It can be argued that this era under the Buyids was the birth of the Sunni and Shia identities as we know them today. Of course, the entrenchment of these identities in opposition to each other was also one of the major causes for some of the violence which took place in Baghdad. These religious scholars came to Buyid courts, and especially Baghdad, because they were being sponsored by wealthy elites. Despite the rough state of Baghdad, it remained a major cultural hub, and libraries, salons, and hospitals were funded as centers of scholarship, and they attracted scholars from across the Islamic world. Their biggest patrons were actually the Buyids' viziers, who were mostly Persians, and they did a lot of the governing for the emirs, who were themselves mostly military leaders, although some viziers even led their own armies at times. Religious scholars were not the only ones being funded either. Buyid courts were filled with poets, musicians, astronomers, philosophers, grammarians, translators, and medical theorists, and they even constructed both a major hospital and an observatory in Baghdad. Persian culture was also strongly promoted. Whereas in the past, Muslim identity had always been connected with Arabic, for the first time, an Islamic Persian identity and court culture developed, and rulers didn't have to choose between the two. Now, there were far too many important scholars under Buyid patronage for me to be able to mention them all, but I don't think I could possibly justify making this video without at least mentioning one, Ibn Sina. If you know anything about Islamic philosophy, or if you've watched my video on medieval medicine, you'll know that Ibn Sina was one of, if not the most influential scholar of the time, and he was, since around 1014, being patronized by the Buyids. For a while he served as the court physician of Majd al-Dawla in Ray, and then he even became the vizier of a couple different emirs until his death in 1037. It was probably in Isfahan, while being funded by its ruler Ibn Kakuya, that he completed his canon of medicine around 1025, which would become a fundamental work for physicians in the Islamic world, and even in Europe once it was translated into Latin. So that was the state of the Buyid Emirates around 1020. Now, in the rest of the video, let's take a look at what actually took place during that decade. By the way, there's a lot of important characters in this narrative, and it can be a little bit hard to keep track of them all, so I made little portraits so that you could follow. Please don't make fun of my drawings. I might cry. Anyway, in 1020, Fars and Iraq were both ruled by a single emir, Sultan al-Dawla. His father had named him as his successor before his death in 1012, and gave Sultan's brothers minor governorships under his authority, which prevented the emirates from splintering. Well, for a while anyway, because in 1018, Qawam al-Dawla, ruling over Kerman in the east, tried to take over Fars with the help of their neighbors, the Ghaznavids. Qawam failed in this, but it basically made Kerman effectively independent from the rest of Fars by 1020. Jabal had also been split in two by this time. Ray was ruled by Majd al-Dawla, and the southern part, centered on Hamadan, was ruled by his younger brother, Shams al-Dawla, who in theory was a vassal to his elder brother, but here too, conflict between them made him effectively independent. One thing that was different about this situation, however, was the presence of the two emirs' mother, Sayyida Shirin, who was a princess of the Buyid Dynasty of Tabaristan, a result of those strategic marriages which I mentioned earlier. When the brothers came to power in 997, they were both still very young, and Sayyida served as regent. But even once they entered into majority rule, their mother continued to be a very powerful figure, and the wars the brothers fought against one another were just as much attempts to gain autonomy from their mother, who strategically switched sides between the two of them, as they were for authority over each other. She played a similar role in Jabal's politics as the Daylamite and Turkish military classes did in Fars and Iraq. As early as 1021, trouble began to brew. The Turks in Baghdad, wanting to reinstate their authority over Iraq, demanded that Sultan renounce the emirate and grant it to his younger brother, Musharrif al-Dawla. Sultan reluctantly agreed, as long as Musharrif would remain his subordinate, but later on he tried to take back Iraq by force. This only made his position worse, however, as Musharrif defeated him in battle and declared himself to be Sultan's equal rather than his vassal. There was sporadic conflict between the two until Sultan's death in 1024. Incidentally, it should be noted that Buyids often died quite young. Our sources say either in battle or because of excessive drinking. In Sultan's case, it seems like he was a little too fond of the old Shiraz, if you catch my meaning. In Jabal, Shams al-Dawla died in 1021 and was replaced by his son, Sama al-Dawla, but his reign didn't last very long. You see, in 1007, Sayyida had placed her nephew, Ibn Kakuya, as ruler of Isfahan, within Shams al-Dawla's domain. Shams had relied upon Ibn Kakuya's help in putting down some rebellions, which helped him become very powerful, and in 1024, he ousted Sama al-Dawla from Hamadan and became the new emir of the region, though he continued to rule from Isfahan. From Iraq, Musharrif tried to restore his cousin Sama, but he was unable, and Ibn Kakuya would continue to rule the region until his death in 1041. Speaking of Musharrif, he didn't last all that much longer, and he died early in 1025. The Turks of Baghdad then ruled independently for a while as they decided who to nominate as their next emir. By this point, there was no question that they were the de facto rulers of the province. They considered choosing Abu Kalijar, Sultan's son who had succeeded him in 1024, but they ultimately chose against it since they worried it would just be a repeat of the situation under Sultan, giving the Daylamite faction in Fars power over them. In the end, after 2 years without an emir, they chose another brother of Sultan's, Jalal al-Dawla, in 1027. Jalal was almost completely powerless as emir, and he was supposedly so poor that in 1031 he had to dismiss all of his servants and release his horses into the streets. Now, this might be an exaggeration due to the fact that most of our historical sources on the Buyids are fairly hostile towards them, but it's not unlikely that the Turks took the opportunity to strip the emir of as much power as they could before placing him as a puppet. Meanwhile, back in Fars, Abu Kalijar was also having some trouble of his own. As I mentioned before, the success of Farsi emirs came with their strong relations with the local landowning elites, but Abu Kalijar seems to have pissed some of them off, though how is not exactly known. He also didn't have the full support of the Daylamites, and a section of them invited Qawam to take over the whole of Fars. So, Qawam tried to do so once again, but once again he was unsuccessful. The two continued to have regular conflicts until Qawam died in 1028, supposedly from poison, and Abu Kalijar finally reinstated Farsi control over Kerman. Now, dynastic struggles were nothing new to the Buyid Confederation. They were rather endemic. And so, in that regard, the 1020s were fairly typical. However, the decade would end with something rather unexpected. Back in Ray, Sayyid Shirin died in 1028, leaving Majd al-Dawla fully in charge of his realm for the first time. However, with the loss of his politically domineering mother, Majd was left without allies. He had to deal with a military uprising, and in order to do so, he asked the ruler of the neighboring Ghaznavids for help. This was a huge mistake. The Ghaznavids dealt with the issue in 1029, but they never left, taking over Ray in a coup and exiling Majd to their capital where he died sometime later. The Ghaznavids had tried to conquer Buyid territory several times in the past, but they only managed to take small bordering towns. This was the first time that they managed to strike such a major blow to the Buyids. In fact, spoiler alert, they would wind up taking Isfahan from Ibn Kakuya in 1030, and he would only get it back after accepting to be their vassal, leaving the whole of Jabal under their control. The decade ended, therefore, with continued internal instability and a serious external threat. Now, it's easy to look at this state of affairs in 1029 and to look ahead at the future conquests of the rest of the Buyid states and say that the Buyids were doomed to fall at this point. And although it might seem inevitable, they did still last for another whole generation. Baghdad would be taken in 1055 and Fars in 1061, in these cases by the Saljuqs, who would overthrow the Ghaznavids to become the new power in the area and continue to expand west into Anatolia. Knowing this, the future might seem inevitable, but there were still children born in 1030 who would grow up to have families of their own by the time these states fell, and it's likely that they may have expected to live under the Buyids for their entire lives. One of the reasons why I created this series is to get this perspective, to zoom into people's lives rather than looking at several decades or even centuries as just stepping stones where one thing inevitably led to the next. I hope that you appreciated this look into this part of the world 1,000 years ago, and I look forward to exploring more of it with you in future videos. For now, though, I wish you all well, and I'll see you next time.